A locked door by the river, yet someone slipped through unseen. Welcome to Rust Evidence. I am your host, Silas Wren. Drop a comment with where you're tuning in. I treasure reading everyone. Let's unravel the silence together. The Seine was swollen that morning, its brown waters sliding past the embankments with a sluggish determination, carrying along pale driftwood and scraps of paper that had escaped the city's grip. Maigret stood on the damp cobbles near the Pont Marie, his coat collar turned up against the drizzle that beaded on the brim of his hat. He was not on duty, not exactly. He had left his apartment on Boulevard Richard Lenoir after breakfast with Madame Maigret. Coffee, fresh bread, a soft-boiled egg, and found himself walking without any real purpose, except perhaps to let the quiet weight of the weather seep into his bones before the day grew noisy with telephones and paperwork. A barge passed slowly, its captain hunched in a dark coat, the smoke of his pipe trailing backward in the rain. Maigret watched it drift under the arches, a familiar melancholy pressing in, the kind that made him aware of the city's unspoken lives, windows that never opened, faces glimpsed behind curtains, doors that stayed shut too long. He had no case that morning, only a faint restlessness. The Quai des Orfèvres waited, with its warm offices and stale files. But he lingered instead by the river, feeling the weight of its grey current. He lit his pipe and drew on it slowly, letting the smoke mingle with the mist. The matches were damp, and it took him 2 attempts before the tobacco caught. Somewhere nearby a bell told the hour. 11, he thought, though he hadn't checked his watch. A woman in a worn green coat hurried past, clutching her handbag to her chest, her shoes tapping sharply on the stones. Maigret noticed her but didn't follow with his eyes. It was the rhythm of her steps that lingered, hurried and uneven, as though she carried too much of something inside. When he finally turned toward the Quai des Orfèvres, a young inspector from the Mobile Brigade was coming down the opposite street, his umbrella struggling against the wind. It was Janvier, cheeks red from the weather, eyes bright with some fresh urgency. He hailed Maigret across the street, nearly slipping on the wet pavement. "Chief, you're wanted at a boarding house on Rue des Bars, just by the river," he said breathlessly when they met halfway. "Nothing official yet, but the concierge insists something's wrong." Maigret nodded, tamping the tobacco in his pipe with a thick thumb. He had not planned on stepping into anyone else's business that morning, yet the river had led him here as it often did. He fell into step beside Janvier, his pace unhurried despite the younger man's urgency. "What is it?" he asked quietly. "A door," Janvier said, "locked from the inside." "The tenant hasn't been seen since yesterday evening." Maigret said nothing. He simply walked, his heavy shoes darkening with each splash in the puddles, the rain whispering along the narrow street. He could already imagine the house, a narrow stair, the smell of old cooking, a door at the end of a corridor. He didn't need details yet. What mattered was the silence waiting behind that door, and the river, flowing so close one could hear it if the night was quiet enough. By the time they reached Rue des Bars, Maigret felt the first stirrings of that familiar weight in his chest. Not alarm, not excitement, but a quiet certainty that behind an ordinary facade, something human had gone awry. The boarding house stood narrow and slightly crooked between 2 taller buildings, its plastered facade streaked with soot and moisture, the windows dim behind thin curtains. A brass plate beside the doorway bore the concierge's name, half tarnished and smudged with fingerprints. Rainwater trickled along the guttering, dripping steadily onto the step as Maigret followed Janvier inside. The smell met him first: boiled cabbage, damp coats, a faint trace of disinfectant. In the tiny lodge, a woman in her 60s leaned forward on her elbows, anxious eyes darting from Maigret's heavy frame to Janvier's younger face. She was the kind of concierge who seemed to absorb everything about her tenants without ever leaving her seat, her pale fingers restless on the counter, a cigarette burning down in the ashtray. "It is on the 3rd floor," she said quickly, her voice low but carrying the sharpness of someone used to whispering gossip and warnings. "Monsieur Viau, he hasn't come out since yesterday. His door is locked." "I hear nothing." Not a sound. Maigret removed his hat, letting the rain drip onto the tiled floor. He didn't answer at once, only let his slow gaze rest on the woman's nervous hands, the trembling ash that threatened to fall. People always said too much when silence pressed on them. "Who is this Monsieur Viau?" "A clerk, I think." Works with an insurance firm near Châtelet. Quiet, polite, never trouble. He comes home at the same hour each evening. Always alone. Janvier shifted beside Maigret, impatient to move, but Maigret kept his voice calm. Yesterday, did you see him come in? Of course, he returned around 7. I heard his door close. After that, nothing. He didn't leave this morning. He always leaves by 8:30. Maigret nodded slightly. He began climbing the narrow staircase, his hand brushing the banister worn smooth by decades of tenants. The stairwell smelled of dust and cooking fat, with a faint odor of damp plaster that clung to the walls. On the first landing, a door opened and a young woman peered out, her hair still in curlers, a cigarette between her lips. She drew back quickly when she saw the inspector, muttering something about the rain. By the time they reached the 3rd floor, Janvier had pulled out a small ring of locksmith tools. The corridor was narrow, a faded rug running along its center, doors set close together. At the far end was the one they wanted, its paint chipped around the handle, a faint smell of stale tobacco leaking through the crack beneath. Janvier looked to Maigret, who only gave a short nod. The younger man bent to the lock, his shoulders tense with the effort. The pins gave way with a soft click, and the door creaked open reluctantly as though disturbed from sleep. The room was small, scarcely more than a box. A narrow bed pressed against one wall, the sheets rumpled but empty. A wooden chair stood by a table, on which a single glass sat, still half filled with water. The air was heavy, unmoving, as if it had been sealed too long. A faint odor, not yet strong enough to be certain, drifted in the stillness, a mixture of stale smoke and something metallic. Janvier stepped forward, but Maigret raised a hand, stopping him. He stood in the doorway, pipe unlit in his thick fingers, his eyes slowly moving over the details. The shoes by the bed were neatly placed, but one of them was damp as though it had been worn out into the rain. A jacket hung on the back of the chair, its pocket bulging with papers. A hat rested neatly on the shelf above the bed. It was the silence that spoke loudest. In boarding houses there was always some sound. A cough through the wall, a radio faintly playing, footsteps on the stair. Here only the rain against the glass. In the corner, beside the small wardrobe, the door to a washroom stood ajar. Maigret crossed the floor heavily, the boards creaking beneath him. He pushed the door open with the back of his hand. The man lay on the tiled floor, one arm bent awkwardly beneath him, his face turned toward the wall. The smell was stronger here, unmistakable. His skin was pale, almost waxy, and his lips bore the faint trace of a smear as though wiped hurriedly. A razor lay nearby, but it had not been used. Janvier swore softly under his breath. The concierge, who had followed them partway up the stairs, gasped audibly in the corridor. Maigret squatted heavily beside the body, his knees creaking, his face expressionless. He touched nothing. He only looked, taking in the details. The shoes, both dry now, but the trousers faintly marked by damp splashes. The faint indentation on the man's wrist where a watch had been, though no watch was present. The closed window, though the air inside was heavier than it should have been. Locked from the inside, Janvier murmured, shaking his head. Yes, Maigret said slowly. Locked. He rose, straightening his heavy shoulders. He stood still for a long moment, the pipe stem resting against his teeth, though he did not light it. He let the silence of the small room press on him, the ordinariness of it. The way death seemed to sit comfortably in the narrow space, as if it had always belonged there. Bring the doctor, Maigret said finally, his voice low, and keep the others out. As Janvier went down the stairs, Maigret turned once more toward the table with its solitary glass. He touched the rim lightly with his thumb, then let his hand fall. The rain beat harder against the window. Somewhere below, the river flowed slow and brown, carrying its secrets away toward the sea. He stood there, still as a piece of furniture, until the sound of hurried footsteps echoed up the stair. He had time to wonder about the missing watch, about the damp shoes, about the silence too carefully sealed behind the locked door. And he knew, though he could not yet have said why, that this was not a simple death, not one to be written neatly in a police report. It would demand patience, waiting, watching. It would demand Maigret. The doctor arrived 20 minutes later, his umbrella dripping onto the stairwell tiles, his moustache damp from the rain. He was a small man with quick, bird-like movements, already fussing with his spectacles as Janvier guided him up to the 3rd floor. Maigret remained where he had been, pipe stem still between his teeth, heavy shoulders filling the narrow doorway of the room. He acknowledged the doctor with a slow nod, then stepped aside to give him space. The examination was carried out with a kind of routine precision. The doctor crouched beside the body, his case open beside him, and bent low over the dead man's face. His hands moved briskly, pulling at the collar, pressing fingers against the waxy skin, peering into the half-closed eyes. All the while Maigret stood silent, listening to the faint rattle of the doctor's instruments and the distant dripping of rainwater in the courtyard below. At length, the doctor rose, brushing dust from his knees. His verdict came in a tone that was meant to sound confident, but carried the faint edge of doubt. Heart failure, most likely. Perhaps brought on by exertion, perhaps stress. He was not a young man. Maigret exhaled slowly, a stream of smoke curling from his pipe. He did not contradict the doctor, nor did he agree. He merely turned his gaze back toward the body on the floor, the crooked arm, the faint trace of something wiped from the lips. He had heard verdicts like this before, delivered quickly to spare the living worry. Yet the missing watch tugged at him, and the shoes that had been damp, and the silence of a room too carefully sealed. The body was carried away discreetly, wrapped and borne down the narrow stairs by two orderlies. The concierge pressed herself against the wall, muttering a prayer beneath her breath as they passed. Maigret, still silent, followed them as far as the landing, then returned alone to the small room. It was empty now, stripped of its most striking detail, and yet the atmosphere remained heavy, as though the walls still held the man's last hours. Maigret sat heavily on the wooden chair, the springs complaining under his weight. He placed his hat on the table beside the glass of water and let his eyes wander over the objects of an ordinary life. On the shelf above the bed were two books, both cheap editions, their spines cracked. On the table beneath the glass lay a folded newspaper. The jacket hanging on the chair gave off the faint smell of tobacco and rain. From the pocket he drew out the bundle of papers he had noticed earlier. Receipts, a bus ticket, a letter folded twice. He unfolded the letter slowly. The handwriting was cramped and hurried, the paper smudged at the edges. It was signed only with an initial, L. The words were ordinary enough, a reminder about money owed, the tone polite but insistent. Yet there was something in the repetition of phrases, as though the writer had not trusted himself to strike directly. Maigret read it twice, then slipped it back into the pocket. Janvier returned, wiping his hands on a handkerchief. He looked at Maigret expectantly, waiting for orders. Maigret gestured toward the chair opposite. "Sit," he said simply. The younger man obeyed, glancing around the dim little room. "What do you think, Chief? Suicide?" Maigret shook his head almost imperceptibly. "Too neat," he murmured. "Too quiet, but the door. It was locked." Maigret puffed once more on his pipe, letting the silence stretch until Janvier shifted uneasily. "Locked doors never tell the truth," he said at last. "They tell what someone wants us to believe." The sound of footsteps in the corridor drew their attention. A man in a grey overcoat stood hesitantly at the threshold, his hat clutched nervously in both hands. He introduced himself as a fellow tenant, a clerk as well, living 2 doors down. He had heard the commotion, he explained apologetically, and wished to ask if Monsieur Vieux was unwell. Maigret's eyes rested on him for a long moment. "Sit," he said again, gesturing to the bed. The man obeyed reluctantly, perching on the edge. His face was narrow, his moustache carefully trimmed, his eyes darting from one corner of the room to another, as though afraid to meet Maigret's steady gaze. "Did you hear anything last night?" The tenant shook his head too quickly. "Nothing unusual." Monsieur Vieux was always quiet. He kept to himself, and yet Maigret prompted gently, "You noticed something?" The man hesitated, then nodded. It was late, past midnight. "I thought I heard a knock, a single one, at his door." I told myself I had dreamed it. After all, it was silent again. Maigret leaned back, his large hands resting on his knees. He said nothing. The silence pressed as it always did, until the man shifted uneasily. Perhaps it was nothing. Perhaps someone lost their way in the dark. Maigret gave a slow nod, as if agreeing, though he had already filed the detail away. A knock in the middle of the night, followed by silence. The tenant excused himself quickly, his relief evident as he slipped back into the corridor. Maigret sat for a while longer, the pipe cooling between his teeth, his gaze fixed on the glass of water, that had not been touched since yesterday. By the time he and Janvier left the boarding house, the rain had eased, leaving the streets slick and shining. They walked slowly toward the Quai des Orfèvres, their steps echoing on the wet stones. At the corner, Maigret paused, looking down toward the river. The brown current rolled on, indifferent, carrying its flotsam past the bridges. He felt again that heaviness in his chest, the certainty that the death of Monsieur Viau would not rest easily in the files. Back at the office, papers were already waiting, reports to be signed, routine matters pressing for attention. Maigret ignored them. He settled heavily into his chair, filling his pipe once more, and called for Janvier. "We will speak with the firm," he said. "Insurance near Châtelet. Quiet men, polite men. They often hide things behind their politeness." Janvier scribbled a note, his brow furrowed. "And the neighbors?" "We will let them wait," Maigret replied. "Neighbors always talk more after a little time." He leaned back, the smoke curling upward toward the ceiling. The missing watch, the damp shoes, the locked door, the knock in the night. Each detail hovered in his mind like a loose thread. He did not yet know how they connected, but he trusted they would. They always did, if one had the patience to sit, to watch, to listen. And Maigret had patience. More than most. He sat there in silence, the river's sluggish weight echoing in his thoughts, and felt the case begin to take shape, not as a puzzle to be solved, but as a life to be understood. The next morning, Paris wore the greyness of damp linen left too long to dry. A fine drizzle clung to the windows of the Quai des Orfèvres, softening the outlines of the river beyond. Maigret arrived earlier than usual, his hat dripping as he hung it on the peg, his coat steaming faintly near the radiator. He had slept restlessly, the image of the locked door returning to him each time he closed his eyes. When Madame Maigret brought him his coffee, he had drunk it in silence, the warmth doing little to ease the heaviness in his chest. He filled his pipe, tamped it with his thumb, and leaned back in his chair. Janvier entered with the morning's reports, his expression still youthful, eager. He placed a file on the desk and waited. Maigret opened it slowly, letting the silence between them stretch until Janvier shifted uneasily. The report was thin. A routine account of the removal of the body, the doctor's note, a statement from the concierge, nothing more. The cause of death had been left as apparent natural causes, though with the suggestion that further examination might clarify matters. Maigret closed the file. "We'll go to the firm," he said simply. The offices of the insurance company were on a side street off Rue de Rivoli, respectable but not prosperous. The stone facade was damp from the rain, the entrance marked by a brass plate polished bright by routine. Inside, the air smelled of ink and damp wool. Clerks sat at narrow desks, their pens scratching softly, their eyes rising curiously as Maigret entered with Janvier close behind. A man in his 50s, stooped and with thinning hair, came forward, introducing himself as the manager. He led them into a small office, furnished with heavy chairs and a desk crowded with ledgers. His manner was polite but wary, as though uncertain what the presence of the police implied. "Monsieur Viau?" the man repeated, lowering his voice instinctively. "Yes, of course. A reliable employee. He had been with us many years, quiet, efficient. We depended on him. Did he have friends here?" Maigret asked, his voice low and even. The manager hesitated, then spread his hands. He kept to himself, Inspector. Courteous but distant. He left promptly at the end of each day. I cannot recall ever seeing him in conversation beyond the necessary. And money. Debts? The manager frowned, glancing at the ledgers as if they might answer. None that I knew of. His wages were modest but sufficient. He lived frugally. Maigret drew on his pipe, the smoke clouding the small office. He watched the manager's discomfort deepen under the silence. At last the man added, "There was a matter last month, a small discrepancy in the accounts he handled. Nothing serious, but it required clarification." He seemed troubled by it. Troubled how? The manager shifted in his chair, nervous, distracted, as if he carried some weight. He assured me it would be corrected, and indeed the figures balanced by the following week. But the impression lingered. Maigret nodded, letting the silence settle again. He could feel Janvier's impatience beside him, the younger man eager for a lead. The manager, relieved to see their questions end, rose quickly, promising to provide copies of the accounts if needed. Back in the corridor, clerks bent their heads over their papers, pens scratching faster. though their ears strained toward the sound of departing footsteps. Outside, the drizzle had thickened into a steady rain. Maigret pulled up his collar, his pipe unlit now, the stem resting between his teeth. They walked without speaking until they reached a small café on the corner. Inside it was warm, the windows fogged, the air heavy with the smell of coffee and damp wool. They found a table near the back, where Maigret ordered beer and Janvier, eager for warmth, asked for a coffee. "What do you think, Chief?" Janvier pressed, leaning forward. "The discrepancy?" Maigret sipped his beer slowly, his gaze fixed on the streaks of rain running down the window. "A man like Viau does not live so quietly without reason," he said at last. "People who hide leave few traces, but they carry their burden in silence." He turned the glass slowly in his hand. "And sometimes silence is heavier than guilt." Janvier frowned, unsatisfied. "But the locked door—" "Patience," Maigret murmured. They returned to the Quai des Orfèvres, where the autopsy report was waiting. The doctor's handwriting was brisk, clipped. The cause of death: poisoning, likely ingested. The stomach contents revealed traces of a bitter compound, consistent with certain household products. The time of death: estimated late evening between 11 and midnight. Janvier whistled softly, his earlier impatience replaced with unease. "So not natural causes after all." Maigret said nothing. He only closed the file, his heavy hand pressing it flat on the desk. Poisoning. A quiet death without struggle. It explained the faint smear at the lips, the silence in the room. But who had brought it and why remained hidden. He thought of the letter in the jacket pocket, signed with an initial. He thought of the missing watch, the knock in the night. Slowly he rose, pulling on his coat again. "Where now?" Janvier asked quickly. "Back to the boarding house," Maigret replied. "The neighbors will have had time to think. They will want to speak, even if they tell themselves they do not." The rain had eased by the time they reached Rue des Bars again. The concierge greeted them nervously, her hands wiping at an already spotless counter. She had heard, of course. News traveled fast in such buildings. Her voice was softer now, carrying a note of fear. Maigret's questions were gentle, almost casual. Had Monsieur Viau ever received visitors? Rarely, she admitted. Perhaps once or twice. A man she could not describe well, always in the evenings, always brief. Had she heard anything unusual the night before? Only that single knock, which she had dismissed at the time. Maigret let the silence work. At last she added, "I did hear steps on the stair later after the knock. Light steps, quick, as if someone wished not to be heard." "Up or down?" Maigret asked. "Down," she whispered. "Now toward the street." He nodded, thanked her, and climbed slowly to the third floor. The corridor was empty, the rug faintly damp where shoes had passed. He stood before Viau's door again, the lock now replaced with a police seal. He did not enter. Instead, he turned toward the neighboring door, the tenant who had spoken of the knock. The man answered quickly, his face pale. He looked as though he had been waiting. His manner was more subdued now, his words slower. Yes, he admitted, he had heard the steps too. He had not said so before, out of fear. He thought perhaps it had been a woman. A woman, Maigret repeated softly. The tenant nodded. The sound was lighter than a man's, and once, some weeks ago, he had seen a shadow in the stairwell, a woman leaving Viau's room late at night. He had not seen her face, only the outline beneath a scarf. Maigret thanked him with a short nod, then stood once more in the dim corridor. The silence pressed in, heavy as before, but now it carried with it the faint trace of another presence. Not just the dead man, but someone else who had crossed this threshold, someone who had left quietly while the river rolled on below. Back outside, the air smelled of wet stone and tobacco from a passing workman's pipe. Janvier looked to Maigret, waiting for instruction. "We will find her," Maigret said simply, his eyes following the sluggish current of the Seine. "Not through haste, through silence. She will reveal herself." "They always do." He lit his pipe then, the smoke curling upward into the damp air, as the rain began again in fine, steady drops. The drizzle had thickened into a fine mist by the time Maigret left the boarding house again, his heavy steps echoing along Rue des Bars. The river flowed silently beside him, swollen and sluggish, its brown surface flecked with small rings where raindrops struck. He pulled his collar higher, the pipe stem clenched between his teeth, and let the dampness creep into his coat without complaint. Beside him, Janvier kept pace, his stride quick and restless, as though eager to chase after the faint trace of a woman who might have slipped down the stairs in the night. They did not speak until they reached the corner where the street broadened toward the quay. Maigret stopped, his large hand resting on the cold stone balustrade, his eyes fixed on the water below. He could feel Janvier's impatience, the younger man almost vibrating with questions. "You think she exists, Chief?" he asked at last. Maigret exhaled a long stream of smoke. "Someone does. Whether she is a lover, a neighbor, or a shadow invented by fear, we shall see." They continued toward the Quai des Orfèvres in silence, their shoes slapping against the wet stones. At the office, Maigret hung up his soaked coat and settled heavily into his chair. He did not light his pipe at once. Instead, he pulled the letter from Viau's jacket pocket from his desk drawer and unfolded it again. The cramped handwriting seemed even more insistent in the grey morning light. "You promised. It cannot be delayed again." El Janvier leaned over his shoulder, a woman's hand. Perhaps not. People disguise themselves on paper more than in speech. He placed the letter flat on the desk and tapped it with his thick finger. "We'll need to know who Elle is. Begin with the firm. Look through his correspondences, his accounts, quietly. No fuss." Janvier nodded, eager for the task. He left quickly, his shoes squeaking on the wet linoleum of the corridor. Maigret remained alone, the letter before him, the rain drumming faintly against the window. He leaned back, eyes half closed, letting the pieces of the case drift in his mind like smoke. The missing watch, the knock at midnight, the faint steps on the stair, the damp shoes placed neatly by the bed. Each detail was small, fragile, but together they pressed on him with a weight that was unmistakable. Toward noon he rose, pulling on his coat again, and wandered to the café across the street. The warmth struck him as he entered, the smell of strong coffee and frying onions enveloping him. He took his usual place by the window, ordered a beer and sat with his pipe cooling in his hand. It was here in these pauses that thoughts surfaced. He could hear the conversations around him, the arguments over prices, the weary laughter of workmen, the hiss of the coffee machine. All of it belonged to Paris, to the city's ordinary rhythm. Yet somewhere in that rhythm, a man had died alone behind a locked door. When he returned, Janvier was already waiting with a stack of papers. He had worked quickly, tracing through the insurance firm's records and correspondence. There were no personal letters filed at the office, but there were notes of transactions, small irregular amounts withdrawn from Viau's salary, unremarkable at first glance, but consistent over several months. The manager had explained them as advances. "Advances," Maigret repeated slowly, his brow furrowing. For what? The manager hadn't known. Viau never said. Maigret tapped the papers with his thick hand, his gaze distant. A man like Viau, careful, discreet, does not take advances without reason. And reason often wears the shape of another person. He rose, slipping into his coat again, and gestured for Janvier to follow. They returned to Rue des Barres, the rain having eased into a dull wetness that lingered on the cobblestones. The concierge looked up sharply when they entered, her expression wary. "Madame," Maigret began gently, "in these buildings nothing escapes notice. A man like Viau, living so quietly, still leaves traces." Who visited him? The woman hesitated, her fingers restless on the edge of the counter. At last she sighed. "A woman, yes. Not often. Always in the evenings. She wore a dark coat, a scarf over her hair. I never saw her face clearly. Young? Younger than him. That much I could tell from her step." Maigret nodded as if she had confirmed something he already suspected. "Did she ever speak to you?" "No, she came and went quickly, always with her head lowered." He left her then, her relief evident, and climbed once more to the third floor. The sealed door stood at the end of the corridor, silent as before. He did not enter. Instead, he knocked softly on the neighboring door again. The clerk who lived there opened reluctantly, his eyes anxious. "You said once that you thought you heard a woman," Maigret said. "Tell me more." The man shifted uneasily. "It was late, Inspector. Past midnight. I had been reading in bed when I heard the knock. Then footsteps, light ones moving down the stair. I told myself I had imagined it. But I have heard them before. Before? Once, perhaps twice. Always late. Always leaving quickly." Maigret's gaze remained fixed on him, heavy, patient. The silence pressed until the man added, "Once I thought I heard her voice. Low hurried, but I could not make out the words. Maigret gave a slow nod and turned away. He had heard enough. Outside, he and Janvier walked once more toward the quay. The rain had stopped, but the sky remained heavy, the river swollen and silent. Janvier could no longer contain himself. "What now, Chief?" "We wait," Maigret said simply. "For what?" "For her to step out of the shadows." "They always do." He lit his pipe then, the smoke curling upward as he stood by the balustrade, watching the river drift past. He felt the weight of the city pressing in, the silence of the locked room still clinging to him. Somewhere behind one of those grey facades, a woman was carrying a burden too heavy to remain hidden, and Maigret, with his patience and his silence, would wait until it pressed her into the open. He stood there a long while, the rain beginning again in soft drops, until the outlines of the case settled quietly into his thoughts. It was not a puzzle to be solved in haste, but a life to be understood, the life of a man who had lived quietly, who had died quietly, and who had left behind only faint traces of someone who could not yet bear to speak. The rain gave way to a dull, overcast afternoon, the streets of Paris shining with the residue of water, the gutters still carrying the last threads of runoff toward the swollen river. At the Quai des Orfèvres, the corridors smelled of damp wool and cigarette smoke, the usual hum of typewriters softened by the weather's weight. Maigret sat at his desk, coat draped over the back of his chair, the familiar pipe glowing faintly. He had said little since returning from Rue des Barres, his silence unsettling even Janvier, who busied himself with notes and reports. A knock at the door broke the stillness. Lucas entered, his hair slick from the rain, his expression carrying a trace of hesitation. He held a slip of paper between two fingers. "Chief, we've traced the letter. The handwriting matches correspondence from a woman named Louise Delcourt. She resides near the Bastille, a seamstress. The connection was made through the bank records. Her name appeared on receipts for payments made by Viau." Maigret reached for the paper without hurry, his heavy fingers folding it once, then twice, as if to feel its weight before opening it. Louise Delcourt. The initial L now given flesh. He leaned back in his chair, smoke curling toward the ceiling, and let the name settle in his thoughts. A seamstress. A quiet trade, but one that often bound women to lives of fragile independence, precarious money, and the weight of favors owed. He rose at last, slipping into his coat, and gestured for Janvier to join him. The walk to Bastille was long, but Maigret preferred it that way. The air was cool, carrying the faint smell of wet stone and coal smoke from chimneys. He walked at his deliberate pace, hat pulled low, while Janvier kept stride with youthful impatience. The city revealed itself in layers, shopkeepers sweeping their thresholds, children darting across puddles, a woman leaning from her balcony to shake a ragged cloth. Ordinary lives, each with their own unspoken burdens. They found the building easily enough, a narrow structure wedged between a bakery and a small bookshop. The stairwell smelled of yeast and old wood, the steps worn smooth by years of tenants. On the second floor a door stood ajar, and the faint sound of a sewing machine clicked steadily within. Maigret knocked lightly, and the sound ceased. A woman's voice, cautious, called out for them to enter. She was in her early 30s, hair pinned neatly, her face pale but composed. The room was sparse, a bed neatly made, a small table with a half-finished meal, and by the window the sewing machine, its belt still swaying faintly from interruption. "Louise Delcourt," Maigret said, his tone neither question nor statement. She nodded, her hands resting on the fabric in her lap. "You are from the police?" Maigret inclined his head. "We are here about Monsieur Viau." Her lips trembled slightly, though her voice remained steady. "He is dead, yes." She lowered her gaze, her fingers worrying the edge of the cloth. For a moment the silence in the room seemed to thicken, broken only by the faint creak of the window frame in the damp air. "You knew him?" Maigret continued. She gave a small nod. "He was kind, reserved. He helped me when I had no one helped you. With money. I did work for him, sewing, mending. But there was more. He advanced me sums when I was behind on rent. He asked nothing in return, and yet you wrote to him pressing for payment." Her head jerked slightly, eyes widening then closing. Her voice dropped. "I was desperate. I feared losing my room. I should not have written so harshly." Maigret let the silence linger. He studied her carefully, the nervous tremor in her fingers, the way her eyes darted toward the floor as though unable to meet his gaze for long. She was not hardened, not practiced in deceit. She was a woman who carried weariness more than cunning. "Did you visit him at Rue des Bars?" Her lips parted, then closed again. She swallowed. "Sometimes. When was the last time?" The words took longer to come. "2 nights ago. At what hour?" "Late. Past 11. Janvier shifted beside him, but Maigret remained still, his gaze heavy on her pale face. "Did you knock?" She nodded faintly once. He opened the door, and then her hands twisted in the fabric. We spoke. He seemed troubled. He said little, but his eyes, they were distant. He poured me water. "I stayed only a short time. I left alone." "Yes?" She spoke quickly, too quickly, as though speed could bury uncertainty. Maigret let the silence stretch again, his pipe unlit now, his large hands resting on his knees. The ticking of the clock on the wall filled the pause. "Your visits were seen," he said quietly. "A neighbor heard your steps." Her face crumpled then, though no tears came. "I never meant harm." He was all I had. Maigret studied her, weighing her words against the details that lingered in his mind. The damp shoes, the missing watch, the smear at the lips, the locked door. She was frightened, yes, but fear did not equal guilt. Guilt carried a heavier silence, one that pressed from within. At last he rose. "We will speak again. For now, stay here. Do not leave Paris." She nodded weakly, her shoulders sagging as though relieved not to be taken away immediately. Maigret and Janvier stepped back into the stairwell, the air smelling faintly of yeast from the bakery below. Outside, the drizzle had returned, fine needles against the skin. Janvier burst out at once. "She lied, Chief. She was there the night he died." "Yes," Maigret murmured. "She was there, then she poisoned him, perhaps." Janvier frowned, incredulous. Maigret walked slowly toward the quay, his pipe stem between his teeth, though unlit. "A woman like that does not kill with poison, not unless cornered. There is something else, something we do not yet see." They reached the river, its brown water sliding past with implacable weight. Maigret leaned on the stone balustrade, his eyes following a scrap of wood drifting slowly with the current. He thought of Viau's quiet life, of the advances taken, of the letter signed only with an initial. He thought of the missing watch, too valuable to vanish by chance. Murder, he said softly, is rarely about malice. It is about need, and needs are never simple. He remained there a long while, the drizzle settling on his shoulders, the smoke finally curling upward as he lit his pipe. The city moved around him, indifferent, but Maigret felt the case settling deeper into his bones. Somewhere in the silence of Viau's life and the hurried steps of Louise Delcourt lay the truth, quiet and stubborn, waiting to surface. And he, with his patience, would wait beside the river until it revealed itself. The fog thickened overnight, and by morning the Seine was barely visible beyond the misted windows of the Quai des Orfèvres. The city seemed muffled, its noise reduced to the occasional echo of a horn or the scrape of a cart's wheels on damp stones. Maigret sat in his office, pipe smoke lingering in slow spirals above his head, his eyes half closed as if he were listening to something that could not be heard. The previous evening with Louise Delcourt weighed on him, not because her words had revealed much, but because of the silences she had left behind. Janvier entered briskly, shaking rain from his coat, his cheeks flushed with cold. He laid a folded report on the desk, his tone carrying a note of triumph. "We checked with the pawnbrokers, Chief. A man's wristwatch silver was brought in yesterday morning. The description matches what Viau was known to wear. No initials, but the make and age fit." Maigret opened his eyes fully, taking the report in his thick hands. "Who brought it?" "The pawnbroker says it was a man in his 40s, shabby, with a cap pulled low. He signed the receipt with a false name." The broker didn't ask questions. Maigret puffed slowly at his pipe, the smoke curling out in a thin ribbon. A false name, but a watch too recognizable to vanish quietly. He let the silence stretch until Janvier shifted on his feet. Then, without looking up, he said, "Find the pawnbroker again. Tell him to think harder. Faces stay in the memory longer than names." When Janvier had gone, Maigret rose heavily, pulled on his overcoat, and walked toward the riverside. The mist clung to him, seeping into his collar, and the river rolled on invisibly below, its presence more sensed than seen. He stood at the balustrade, pipe stem between his teeth, thinking of Louise Delcourt, a seamstress, young but already worn with worry, who admitted to being in Viau's room the very night he died. Yet the letter, insistent and desperate, suggested something more practical than passion. Money, and behind money, perhaps someone else. By late morning, he returned to her building near Bastille. The stairwell smelled of stale bread and damp plaster. She opened the door at once, as if she had been expecting him, her face pale, her eyes rimmed with sleeplessness. She let him in without protest, gesturing toward the small table where yesterday's bread lay untouched. "You came back," she said softly. "I told you I would," Maigret replied, lowering himself heavily into a chair. She sat opposite him, her hands folded tightly in her lap. The sewing machine was silent now, its wheels still. "The watch," Maigret said quietly. "It is missing." Her eyes flickered, her lips parting, but no words came. "You saw it perhaps when you were in his room." "It was not on his wrist. Someone took it." She swallowed, her hands trembling slightly. "I did not take it. No, but you may know who did." Her silence deepened, the ticking of the clock on the wall filling the room. At last she whispered, "He had a visitor before me, a visitor. A man. I heard his voice when I arrived." The door opened only after a long pause. Vial looked pale. The man slipped past me on the stair, his cap pulled low. I did not see his face clearly. Maigret leaned forward, his gaze heavy but not accusing. "Why did you not tell me this yesterday?" "Because I was afraid." "If they thought I had betrayed him, they—" Her lips trembled again, but she said nothing more. Maigret rose slowly, his large frame filling the room. He put on his hat, tamped the tobacco in his pipe with a thumb. "We will speak again, mademoiselle. Do not leave Paris." She nodded faintly, her eyes lowered as though she carried a burden too heavy to share. Back at the Quai des Orfèvres, Janvier was waiting, breathless from haste. The pawnbroker remembered more. The man who pawned the watch was known in the neighborhood. He had seen him loitering near the cafes along Rue de la Verrerie, a fellow by the name of Marchand. Small-time gambler, always in debt. Maigret listened, his pipe smoke curling upward in silence. At last he said, "Bring him." Quietly. By evening, Marchand was seated across from him in the interrogation room, a thin man with restless eyes and hands that twitched as though they sought cards. He smelled faintly of stale wine and cheap tobacco. "You pawned a watch yesterday," Maigret said without preamble. Marchand shifted, eyes darting. "Found it," he muttered. On the quay, Maigret leaned forward, his heavy hands flat on the table. "Found watches do not come with straps still warm from the wrist." Marchand licked his lips, his voice faltering. "A fellow gave it to me. Told me to pawn it. Who? I don't know his name." "I never saw him before." Maigret's silence pressed on him, thicker than any shouted accusation. The man's words faltered again. "He was waiting outside a boarding house near the river. Handed me the watch, said to get rid of it quick. Paid me a few francs. That's all." Maigret exhaled smoke slowly, his gaze steady. "Which boarding house?" Marchand's eyes flickered, then dropped. "Rue des Bars." The silence in the room grew heavier still. Marchand squirmed, his fingers drumming nervously. "I didn't kill him," he stammered. "I only took the watch." Maigret rose at last, signaling to Lucas to take him away. Alone again, he stood at the window. The fog pressing against the glass, the city reduced to shadows. The circle was tightening. Vial, the quiet clerk, had been visited by a man before his death, a man who slipped away, leaving behind a poisoned silence. Louise Delcourt had been there too, her presence born of desperation, not malice. And Marchand, the gambler, had been used as a convenient hand to erase a trace. But the watch was not the heart of it. The watch was only the thread that dangled, waiting for someone patient enough to follow. Maigret, pipe heavy between his teeth, knew that the truth lay not in the object, but in the silence around it. The hesitation in Louise's voice, the missing name on Marchand's lips, the pale fear in the concierge's eyes when she spoke of steps on the stair. He returned home late that night, the fog still clinging to the city, Madame Maigret waiting with warm soup and quiet concern. He ate slowly, listening to the rain beginning again outside, his thoughts circling back always to the locked door, to the silence that had covered a death. When he finally laid down his pipe, the heaviness in his chest had not lifted. It would be a long case. He would have to wait, as always, for silence to break, and when it did, it would not be through confession shouted in anger, but through the quiet collapse of a human heart, carrying more than it could bear. The fog held close to the city the next morning, turning the lamps along the quays into faint, blurred globes and muffling the steps of early workers. Maigret left his apartment later than usual. His breakfast with Madame Maigret stretched by a silence she did not question. She had grown used to his absences of thought, the way he sat with his coffee cooling in his hand, eyes fixed on nothing, yet seeing everything. When he finally stood and took his hat from the peg, she asked nothing, only adjusted the collar of his coat with a small maternal gesture. At the Quai des Orfèvres, the atmosphere was damp and heavy, as if the fog outside had seeped into the walls. Lucas was already waiting with notes from the night watch. Nothing new. The boarding house had remained quiet, its tenants uneasy but subdued. Marchand, the gambler, had spent the night in a cell alternating between bluster and silence. Louise Delcourt had not moved from her small room, a neighbor having confirmed her lamp still burned at dawn. Maigret nodded but said nothing. He sat heavily at his desk, pipe stem resting against his teeth, the papers before him left untouched. The weight of the case was not in the details of reports, but in the silences around them. Viau, the quiet clerk, had lived carefully, discreetly. Yet in his last days, he had been pressed by money, visited by a woman, and finally shadowed by a man who left only a missing watch behind. Janvier entered, his coat still damp from the street, his young face carrying eagerness. He had spoken again with the pawnbroker. Marchand had not lied entirely. The man who gave him the watch had indeed lingered near the boarding house on Rue des Barres. A figure known in the quarter, though not by name. Seen often in the cafes where cheap wine dulled debts. A shadow, Maigret murmured more to himself than to Janvier. He rose, pulled on his overcoat and gestured for Janvier to follow. They walked slowly through the mist-shrouded streets, the city muffled, its outlines blurred. Maigret stopped often, looking at the river, at doorways, at faces passing quickly with scarves pulled high. He was not searching in the ordinary sense. He was allowing the city to show itself, to breathe out its secrets in its own time. They reached the cafe nearest the boarding house, a dim place with fogged windows and the smell of damp tobacco. Inside, men hunched over glasses of wine, though the hour was barely noon. The keeper, wiping glasses with a grey rag, stiffened slightly at Maigret's presence. A man, Maigret said softly, shabby, cap pulled low, lingers here sometimes. The keeper hesitated, then shrugged. Many like that. But one, yes, sits often in the corner. Calls himself Albert. Plays cards badly, drinks on credit. When did you last see him? 2 nights ago. Maigret's gaze lingered on the man until he shifted uneasily. With company, perhaps a woman once. Dark coat, scarf. She never stayed long. Maigret thanked him with a short nod and left, his heavy shoes echoing on the wet pavement. Outside, Janvier's impatience broke through. Chief, this is it. The man before Louise. He was the one in Viau's room, perhaps, Maigret said quietly. But not all visitors kill. Some only watch, some only threaten. They walked on, the fog thinning as the afternoon wore. By the river, Maigret paused, his hands resting on the cold stone. The water slid past unseen, carrying its silence. He thought of Louise again, her pale face, the tremor in her voice. She had spoken of fear, of debts, of a man slipping past her on the stair. Not lies, but not the whole truth either. That evening, back at the Quai des Orfèvres, he sent for Marchand again. The gambler shuffled in, eyes darting nervously. Maigret let the silence settle before speaking. The man who gave you the watch, Albert, they call him. Where did you meet him? Marchand licked his lips. On the quay, near the river. He said nothing, only pushed it into my hand. For how much? 10 francs. Too little, Maigret murmured. Too little for silence. Marchand shifted, his hands restless. I swear, Chief, I know nothing more. Maigret's silence pressed until the man's voice cracked. He told me to forget him. Said the watch was unlucky. When Marchand had been led away, Maigret sat alone, the pipe smoke thick around him. An unlucky watch. A phrase born not of superstition, but of guilt. Someone had wanted the watch gone quickly, to erase a trace too obvious to remain. Late that night he walked again by the river, the mist lifting, the lamps reflected in the sluggish brown water. The city was quieter, its noise subdued. He stood with his hands in his pockets, pipe unlit, and thought of Viau, a quiet man, ordinary, who had lived within narrow lines until someone else's need had crossed them. Gale watch-pawned, a letter written, a woman pressed by desperation, a man hiding in the fog. It was not finished. The silence had not yet broken, but Maigret felt the shape of it now, the weight pressing in. He would not chase it with noise. He would wait, and in waiting the truth would come. It always did. When he returned home, the streets were empty, the fog rising slowly from the stones. Madame Maigret had left a plate covered on the table, the soup cooled but waiting. He ate slowly, silently listening to the faint ticking of the clock. The case lived in him still, its silence heavier than words. He knew that tomorrow or the day after, something would shift. Someone's silence would crack, as it always did, and in that small break the truth would quietly surface. The fog had thinned by morning, but Paris still wore a damp heaviness, the kind that clung to clothes and made the city seem quieter than usual. At the Quai des Orfèvres, the corridors stirred lazily into life, clerks setting down wet umbrellas, typewriters starting their steady clatter. Maigret arrived later than the others, his broad frame filling the doorway, his coat glistening faintly from the drizzle. He paused at his office window, looking out at the dull surface of the Seine before lowering himself heavily into his chair. The case lived in him still, its silence pressing more than any evidence. Janvier came in almost at once, carrying a folder, his energy undiminished by the weather. He reported that Marchand had been restless all night in his cell, demanding release, insisting on his innocence. He repeated the same story. He had been given the watch to pawn, nothing more. No names, no details. Maigret listened, his pipe stem resting between his teeth, the smoke rising in thin curls. He didn't answer immediately, only tapped ash into the tray and studied the folder in Janvier's hand. What about the man they call Albert? Janvier shook his head. No trace yet. He is known, yes, but as a shadow. No fixed address, no work. A man seen, then unseen. Maigret exhaled smoke slowly. Shadows often cast themselves on walls without realizing. He stood, pulling on his coat, and signaled for Janvier to follow. They walked through the grey morning streets, the drizzle light but steady, their shoes slapping on the damp stones. Their first stop was the café near Rue des Bars. Inside it was warm, heavy with smoke and the sour smell of last night's wine. Men hunched over small glasses, their faces worn, their eyes quick to dart away when Maigret entered. The keeper looked up from behind the counter, wary but resigned. "Albert," Maigret said softly. The man hesitated, drying his hands on the rag. "He hasn't been in since the night before last. Where does he sleep?" The keeper shook his head. "Here, there, nowhere. Sometimes with a woman near Rue Saint-Antoine, sometimes by the docks. He has no place of his own." Maigret nodded slowly. The silence in the room thickened, the men at their tables watching without looking. He asked no further questions, only left a few francs on the counter and stepped back into the damp air. They walked toward Rue Saint-Antoine, the district alive with morning carts and vendors. At a narrow doorway, a woman leaned against the frame, scarf tied loosely around her hair, her face sharp with weariness. She looked at Maigret with suspicion, but something in his steady gaze softened her. "You're looking for Albert," she said before he spoke. "Yes," she shrugged, lighting a cigarette with fingers that trembled faintly. "He hasn't come since yesterday. He owes me money. He owes everyone money. Did he speak of Viau?" Her eyes flickered, then lowered. "Only that he had business with him." "Serious business," he said, "but Albert's words are always serious until he drinks them away." Maigret studied her quietly. She shifted uneasily under his silence. "He was afraid," she added in a low voice, "afraid of something that had gone too far." Maigret left her then, his coat collar pulled high against the drizzle. Beside him, Janvier's impatience grew. "Chief, we should search the docks. We could find him quickly." "No," Maigret murmured. "He will come to us." They returned to the Quai des Orfèvres, where Lucas had gathered further details. Fayot's accounts had shown irregularities beyond the supposed advances, small sums but repeated, money flowing out steadily without clear explanation, to quiet theft or quiet blackmail. Maigret sat heavily, filling his pipe, the smoke thickening once more in the small office. He thought of Viau's life, careful, orderly, yet pressed by debts not his own. A man like Albert, always in need, always in shadow, might have pressed him, using the threat of exposure or shame. And Louise Delcourt, desperate but loyal, caught between gratitude and fear. By late afternoon the door opened again, and the concierge from Rue des Bars was shown in. She stood awkwardly, her hands twisting in her apron. Her voice was nervous. "Inspector, I have remembered something. The night before they found him, after the knock, after the steps down the stair, I heard another sound, a voice low muttering, I thought it was in a dream. But it came from the corridor. Whose voice? I cannot say. A man's. Harsh, hurried, Maigret's pipe went out as he listened. He leaned back in his chair, the silence pressing heavy. A voice, a knock, footsteps, a locked door. The picture darkened but did not yet sharpen. He dismissed her gently, then sat alone for a long while, his thoughts circling. The watch had been taken not as spoils, but as something to be disposed of quickly. A poison had been given not with rage but with calculation. And behind it all a man who lived in shadows, and a woman whose silence trembled under fear. That evening he walked once more by the river, his broad figure half vanished in the mist, pipe smoke mingling with the fog. He stood by the balustrade, watching the brown water slip past unseen. He knew the case had reached the point where silence would soon crack. It might come from Albert, cornered by his own debts, or from Louise, unable to carry her fear alone, or from the neighbors whose whispers thickened with time, but it would come. The city never held its secrets forever. When he returned home, Madame Maigret met him with a quiet smile, a plate of stew warming on the stove. He sat at the table, his large hands folded, his eyes distant. He spoke little, but in his silence she understood. He was waiting, as he always did, for human nature to betray itself. And he knew it would. Tomorrow, or the day after, the locked door beside the river would open, not with keys, but with words no longer held back. The day broke grey and sullen, the kind of morning when Paris seemed to draw its shutters more tightly, as if unwilling to reveal itself. At the Quai des Orfèvres, the fog hung low along the river, the lamps still glowing faintly though the hour was late. Maigret arrived with the heaviness of a man who had spent the night thinking rather than sleeping. His pipe was already lit, the smoke curling from beneath the brim of his hat as he stepped into the corridor. He said little to the clerks who greeted him, only made his way to his office and settled into the chair that creaked under his bulk. The case was no closer to clarity, yet in its silence he felt something stirring, as though the truth were pressing faintly against the edges. Waiting to emerge, Janvier entered quickly, his cheeks flushed, his eyes bright with a hint of urgency. He carried a note, folded once, and laid it carefully on the desk. A message, Chief, from a cab driver. He swears he took Albert last night from the docks to Rue des Bars. Maigret raised his eyes, the pipe stem resting between his teeth. To Rue des Bars. To Rue des Bars. Yes. He dropped him at the corner near the river. Said Albert looked nervous. Paid him in small coins. Maigret exhaled slowly, the smoke drifting between them. A shadow returning to the scene. He tapped the ash from his pipe and rose, pulling on his coat. Come. They walked through the damp streets, the drizzle misting their hats, the city stirring reluctantly into life. At Rue des Bars, the boarding house loomed narrow and crooked as before, its facade streaked with moisture, the windows dim. The concierge looked up sharply as they entered, her eyes widening. Inspector, I didn't expect— Has anyone been here? Maigret asked softly. She hesitated, fingers twisting the hem of her apron. Only the tenants, as usual. No one else. Maigret studied her in silence until she shifted uncomfortably. He turned without another word and began to climb the narrow stair, his steps heavy, deliberate. The corridor on the third floor was still, the sealed door waiting at the end. He did not approach it. Instead, he stopped midway in front of the clerk's door, the man who had once spoken of the knock. He knocked gently, and after a pause the man appeared, his face pale with unease. Inspector. Maigret's gaze held him, steady and unhurried. Did you hear anything last night? The clerk swallowed, his hand tightening on the doorframe. Steps, light ones. Up and down more than once. I dared not open a pause, and a voice perhaps, low, hurried. I could not catch the words. Maigret gave a slow nod and turned away, leaving the man to his fear. He continued to the sealed door, stood before it without touching it. The silence pressed there still, heavy as the first day he had entered. He remained for a long moment, pipe smoke mingling with the damp air, before turning back toward the stair. Outside the drizzle had thickened, the street glistening. Maigret leaned against the balustrade, his eyes fixed on the river, brown and swollen, carrying its secrets steadily away. He spoke softly, almost to himself. He came back, not to look but to finish something. Janvier shifted beside him. Then he's guilty. We should— Maigret raised a hand, silencing him. Guilt is not always in the hand that strikes. Sometimes it is in the silence that follows. They returned to the Quai des Orfèvres, where Lucas was waiting with fresh information. Albert had been seen in a café near the Bastille that very morning, drinking quickly, muttering to himself, leaving abruptly when another patron entered. The keeper described him as pale, drawn, a man who had not slept. Maigret listened, pipe smoke curling from his lips, then rose again. Find him, quietly. By late afternoon, Albert was brought in, his shabby coat damp, his cap pulled low, his eyes darting. He smelled of wine and fear. Seated across from Maigret, he tried at first to bluster, then to smile. But the silence pressed too heavily. "You were at Rue des Barres last night," Maigret said softly. Albert shifted. His hands restless. "No." The silence thickened. "Yes," he muttered at last. "I went, but not inside. I only looked. Why? Because I feared he had spoken. Spoken of what?" Albert's eyes flickered, his lips trembling. "Of the money. The small sums. He lent to me again and again, and I could not repay. He threatened to tell." Maigret leaned back, his broad frame filling the chair. "So you poisoned him?" Albert's face crumpled. "No, I swear. I thought of it. I thought of many things. But I had no courage. When I left him that night, he was alive." Silence pressed again, heavier than accusation. Albert lowered his head, his voice breaking. "He begged me not to return. Said he was finished. I left." Maigret watched him, his eyes unreadable. The truth pressed somewhere near, but not yet clear. Albert was a shadow, a man of debts and threats, yet perhaps not the hand that gave the poison. The watch, taken and disposed of in haste, was his, yes, but the quiet death, the glass of water left untouched, the smear at the lips, these bore another's weight. He dismissed Albert to the cells and sat alone in his office, the lamp casting a dim glow, the fog pressing against the window. He thought again of Louise Delcourt, her pale face, her trembling silence. She had spoken of fear, of gratitude, of debts repaid in stitches of cloth and in borrowed coins. She had been there that night after Albert, after the knock. She had seen Viau troubled, distant. She had left quickly, she said. But had she? Or had she lingered, unable to bear the burden he carried for her? The pieces hung in the air like smoke, unsettled but forming slowly. Maigret knew the time was near when silence would break, not with proof on paper, not with a fingerprint or a trace, but with a quiet collapse, a truth too heavy to remain unspoken. He lit his pipe once more, the glow briefly warming his features, and leaned back heavily in the chair. The locked door beside the river waited, its silence still intact, but Maigret felt it beginning to tremble. And he knew that soon, very soon, the quiet truth would step into the open, as inevitable as the river's slow, unbroken flow. The river carried a sluggish sheen under the late afternoon light, its brown surface broken only by drifting scraps of wood and the faint wake of a passing barge. Maigret stood by the balustrade, pipe stem clenched between his teeth, the smoke curling upward into the damp air. He had left the Quai des Orfèvres without a word, walking slowly as if to let the city speak. It often did when given time. By the time he returned to the narrow stairwell on Rue des Barres, the decision had already settled in him. The concierge looked startled when he appeared, but said nothing. He climbed to the third floor, his steps deliberate, and knocked softly on the door across from Viau's sealed room. A pause, then the shuffle of feet, and Louise Delcourt opened the door. Her face was pale, her eyes rimmed with sleeplessness, her scarf hastily tied. She looked at him as though she had expected this moment, as though it had been moving toward her since the night of the knock. He entered without waiting, lowering himself heavily into the single chair. She remained standing, her hands clutching at the edge of the table, her breath unsteady. He let the silence grow, filling the room until it pressed on her. He looked at her gently, the pipe smoke drifting between them. "You returned that night," he said quietly. After Albert left, her lips parted, then closed. She lowered her gaze, unable to meet his eyes. He was weary, Maigret continued, a man already carrying a burden too heavy. "You saw it. Perhaps he spoke of it, the money he had given, the advances he had taken for your sake. You saw how close to despair he was." She trembled, her hands tightening on the table. "I begged him not to give more," she whispered. "He said it was nothing, but I knew it was everything." Maigret's voice softened further. "The poison, it was not meant in anger. It was meant in silence. He took it himself." She raised her head sharply, eyes glistening. No, you cannot, but her voice broke. The protest dissolved into a choked sob. She covered her mouth with her hand, her shoulders shaking. He waited, saying nothing, letting her words come when they would. At last she whispered, "He poured the glass while I was there." He spoke so calmly. He said I must not blame myself, that I should go, that it was better this way. He kissed my hand, and I fled. I heard the door close, the lock turn behind me. Her voice faltered. She sank onto the bed, her face buried in her hands. Maigret sat in silence, the pipe cooling between his teeth. The truth had come, not with drama, but with the quiet collapse of a heart too tired to hold its weight. Verhu, the silent clerk, had lived carefully, lending what he could not afford, carrying the desperation of another until it crushed him. Albert had pressed him, yes, had stolen the watch in fear, had scattered shadows around his last hours. But the death was his own choice, an escape from burdens carried too long. Maigret rose heavily, setting his hat upon his head. He looked at Louise, still trembling on the bed. His voice was low, steady. "You will not be charged, but you will live with what he gave you, and with what you could not give back." She did not answer. He left her there, the narrow room holding the echo of her sobs. Outside, the river moved on, indifferent, carrying the city's secrets as it always had. Maigret stood for a moment by the balustrade, watching the sluggish water. He felt the heaviness in his chest, not of victory but of understanding. A locked door, a missing watch, a knock in the night, each detail had led here, to the quiet truth of an ordinary man undone by ordinary burdens. Back at the Quai des Orfèvres, he hung up his coat, filled his pipe once more, and lowered himself into his chair. He did not write at once. He let the silence of the office settle around him, the murmur of typewriters drifting faintly from the corridor. It was not triumph, he felt, only the familiar melancholy of having seen too deeply into the small tragedies that filled his city. When at last he rose to leave, the fog was lifting from the river, the lamps beginning to glow along the quays. He walked slowly homeward, his broad figure blending into the evening mist, carrying with him the knowledge that behind every locked door lay not mystery alone, but the quiet weight of human need, loneliness, and despair. And it was this, not evidence, not confession, that he had uncovered once again beside the river.